Today we're going to talk about the Affordable Care Act. Obviously, that's something that a big subject for all of us. And really, what we want to talk about today is that it's more than just reporting, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's a big misperception out there today, is that the Affordable Care Act is a reporting requirement versus what it really is, which is much more than that. You know, a quick background on My HR Concierge. We've been around since 2009. We work with independent grocers from California to New York and everywhere in between. We work with clients from 5 employees to well over 1,200 employees. So, you know, from that aspect, regardless of your size, we can certainly help you. And what we try to do is provide solutions to you that allows your management team to focus on your stores and your business versus human resource subjects like the Affordable Care Act and employee workforce management issues. We provide a myriad of services. We provide human resource outsourcing services. Basically what we do is we have very flexible services that can work with your administrative, the way you're currently staffed administratively. And again, our goal is to reduce that risk associated with that employee management and allow you to focus on your business. And you know, in that aspect, we can do as much or as little of the HR function as you need. We also help with the Affordable Care Act, whether that just be consultation to make sure that you are compliant, you know what you need to be doing, all the way to we do have a system that you can utilize that will perform your monthly calculations, which we'll talk a little bit about here in a few minutes, and also prepare your year-end annual forms. In addition to that, we can also do background checks, drug tests, handbooks, performance management programs, and so much more. Really, it's a one-stop shop from a human resource perspective. And I think that's why we partner so well with FMS, because so many of both clients, you know, together we can bring you know, accounting services, payroll services, and human resource services, which really help define that back-end administrative function of every business, not just grocers. So that's a little bit about us and what we do. And again, what we want to talk about today is the Affordable Care Act, and you know that it really is more than just reporting. You know, that's a big misperception that we see. You know, I talk to a lot of people regarding the Affordable Care Act, and you would not believe the number of people I talked to that called me in March and said, I know there's this Affordable Care Act, and I know there's something I need to do. I'm not real sure what it is. There's some reporting. Can you help me with that? And so they had not done any of the other requirements of the Affordable Care Act. A lot of people see it, and I've heard this analogy. Actually, had a company or a president of a company tell me this, that they viewed the Affordable Care Act. He's like, well, it's just like 1099s, right? We prepare them at year end, and at that point, it's over. But if you really think about it, if you think about a 1099, which hopefully you're all familiar with, that's the form that you provide your vendors, that basically you provide them a copy and a copy to the government that states basically how much money you paid them during the year. But if you think about it, that is a year-end reporting. You are providing the 1099s, but throughout the year you have to enter bills, you have to pay bills, so you have all those transactions every day that are reported in that 1099. So in order to get that 1099 right, you have transactions that are performed basically throughout the year. And that's really the way the Affordable Care Act is. You know, it's not just something that you do at the end of the year and then you kind of take a deep breath and say, whew, another 12 months, I won't have to worry about it. And so, you know, just to try and visualize the perception, you know, it's perceived that you have this, you know, it's reporting, and reporting is it, and then you have all these other things that kind of go with it. You know, determining do you have to comply, and affordability, and then there's these calculations they always talk about. But really, it's just reporting. And the issue is if you don't do the other components, you don't know how to report. Because in reality, all these things work together. The Affordable Care Act has a lot of different components, but all of them work in unison together. None of them are isolated. So we always have to determine if we are an ALE, if we have to comply. Most of you on this call, you probably already know that you have to comply. You also have to calculate the affordability, right? Because every year you're going to redo your policy, and you're going to your insurance policy, and you're going to have different premiums, and you're going to have to figure out the whole 9.5% and which safe harbors you're going to use. Then you also have to identify who the eligibles are and who you need to offer, right? Because we have to make sure that we offer the individuals that we're supposed to. And then we also have to do the reporting, and we can't do the reporting without knowing who we should have offered, who was eligible, and who we should have offered. And you know, I've heard so many stories. I've heard of companies, they didn't do these steps in unison. Again, they used kind of that model, the model before this, where it's all reporting. So what they did was, I've heard of companies that gave everybody 1095s and said that everybody was offered. I've heard of companies that didn't do anything. They didn't offer. They didn't do any of the calculations. They didn't offer any of the reports. And all that causes issues, because you know, if they just give everybody a 1095 and say everybody was offered, you're going to have individuals that probably weren't offered that try to go to the exchange, and if their 1095 says they were offered, they're not going to be able to get their subsidies. And so it's not, again, this is not an isolated case. It's not an island. Every one of these components is not an island unto itself. They all work together. So if we think about it, you know, let's think about this from an economic standpoint. If you look at it and you say, you know, the heck with it, I'm only going to worry about reporting. So let's look at the economics of that decision. If we do not identify and offer the eligible employees that should be offered, and we don't offer at least 95% of those, then we have penalty A. Now, there are other penalties, but we're going to kind of focus on penalty A because that's the big one. So if we don't offer 95% of those eligibles, it's a $2,000 per full-time employee fine. Not ones that weren't offered. They're going to take all your full-time employees, they're going to multiply it times $2,000. That's your penalty. So if you have 100 full-time employees and full-time equivalents, that would be a $200,000 annual penalty. Okay? It's a big number. Now, if we just don't report, and we say, hey, we'll do everything else, but we're not going to report, the fine is $500 per form, which effectively, if you think about that, that's going to be everybody that's a full-time employee or equivalent should get a form. So that's $500. So if you have 100 full-time equivalents, if you have 100 of those times $500, that's $50,000. So if you were going to pick one to ignore, I definitely wouldn't ignore that step of identifying and offering these eligible employees. That's where your economic risk is. And so, you know, that's why it's so important that we do these calculations and make sure that we're offering those individuals, and we're not just considering this a year-end reporting. Now, one of the big changes in 2016 versus 2015, in 2015, essentially, we somewhat got a pass. Not all the way, but we got some. Because what happened was the government said, as long as we offer 70% of our eligible employees in 2015, then we won't get the big penalty, the penalty A, which is the $2,000 per full-time employee, full-time equivalent. So that's not too bad, right? Most people can do that. However, in 2016, that goes to 95%. So in 2015, if you had 100 full-time, employees that were eligible, full-time equivalents, you could miss 30 and still be okay. You're not getting the big penalty. In 2016, you can only miss 5, and that's a huge difference. Obviously, that's a huge difference. So it's so important. Again, it's important that these calculations are made. Now, the other reason that these calculations are important is one thing that happens, and it's just like I stated it just a minute ago. and this is very common, everybody states the penalties in an annual perspective. So that penalty of $2,000 is really if that error occurred in all 12 months. But in actuality, those calculations are done every month. So effectively, if we messed up in February, and you know what, we didn't, we had 10 people that should have been offered that weren't offered, and therefore we're going to get that penalty. If we're doing our calculations in March, we see that error and we can correct it. Therefore, we only have 1 month of penalty. So we only have 1/12 of the $2,000 penalty times all of my full-time and full-time equivalents. So by doing the calculations, not only does it help you to determine who should be offered, what it also does is if you ever do just mess up, there's just an administrative error, you can fix that and fix it quickly so that you don't have the full risk of the $2,000 penalty. So that's very important. Now, some common questions, and I get these all the time. How am I going to get caught, and why would they care? And again, this goes back. This was, let's compare this to the 1099s. Now, I'm sure all of you are familiar with 1099s. As we said, a lot. You fill them out, you send them in, and that's really all you ever hear about it. You don't hear anything else about it typically, and so you don't get, there's not that follow-up, that audit to see if you actually did it right and to fine you, even though they most certainly can. So the question is, why would this be different? Why would this 1094 and 1095 forms be different? To be quite honest, we really don't know. We don't know how diligent they're going to be, the IRS is going to be in coming back and auditing this information that you're sending to them to see if all of the appropriate people were offered, to see if everybody that should have gotten a 1095 was actually provided one, those kind of things. What we do know a few things, and this will play out the longer this law is in effect. Then obviously we'll have history behind it, and we'll have a little more experience, and we'll kind of know how that's going to play. But these are some things that we do know. We do know that the fines associated with the Affordable Care Act are significant sources of funding. If you look at the Affordable Care Act, economically, it hasn't really played out the way it was portrayed by the administration. So you've got companies that are bailing, you've got insurance companies that are bailing out of the exchanges because they can't make any money. You've got all these different costs associated with the Affordable Care Act that are greater than what was perceived. These fines or penalties are a way to help subsidize some of that, right? So they're a big source of funding. We also know that the IRS budgeted to hire over 9,000 people specifically related to the Affordable Care Act and its implementation and enforcement. It's a lot of people. You have to pay for them somehow, right? I'm sure they didn't do that just to hire these people and say, that's okay, we've got a budget to cover it. They're going to have to pay for themselves somehow. Also, what we know is that information, the way it works is that the information is sent in by insurance carriers. You have information sent in by insurance issuers, self-insured groups. You have companies such as yourself. You have governmental agencies for government-sponsored plans. All this information is sent in from all these different places, and that information is then compared and contrasted to figure out who was offered, who wasn't, and those kind of things. Basically, what they've tried to do is build a software package that can take this, compare it, and then spit out anomalies or red flags that they then can take that and audit. The other piece to this is it is such a political hot button, right? Because this was portrayed as we knew it was going to cost money, but it's the administration's golden goose right now. It was a big deal that they put out, and so they want to make it work. And if financially it's not working, they've got to get the money from somewhere. And so these penalties are a way to do that. Again, are they going to be very diligent? Are they going to go out and audit everybody? Probably not. they going to audit some? Probably so. And we really don't know yet how they're going to do that. And so, it's better be safe than sorry to make sure that you don't get a big bill down the line. So again, if we look back at that annual process, and again, this is annual, we got to make sure that we determine if we have to comply. Again, that's if you're an applicable large employer. We want to determine that affordability. So we want to make sure, that we're offering that 9.5% or whatever, and using whatever safe harbors that we can. Now, obviously, that's an economic decision. We know that companies, for lack of a better term, opt out, and they would rather pay the penalty than get the insurance. But that's all an analysis that has to be done. Then we have to determine who's eligible for the coverage, and then we have to offer the coverage, and then we also have to perform the reporting requirements. And again, all those kind of play in together. They're not isolated. So one of the big things, and what we'll focus on, is identifying these eligible employees. Your full-time employees, they're fairly straightforward, right? They're scheduled 30 hours per week, every week. There's really no discussion. There's really no a question as to whether they should be offered or not. Those folks, they should be offered. Where always the trick comes in are these variable and seasonal employees. Because what we have to do with those individuals is we do have to perform measurement period calculations, and there's two of them. There's the initial measurement period calculation, and then there's the standard measurement period calculation. Obviously, those are very different, and it's important that we do both of those. I run into so many companies that only do one. And an example of that is, a lot of people, what we find is they only look at I find a lot that maybe they look at the first 90 days of an employee's work, and so if they're averaging 30 hours, we put them on as full time. If they're not, they don't get offered, and we don't worry about them. There's a lot more complexity to it than that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So really, you have to do both of these components, not just one of them. A question that always comes up as well is variable hour designation. So a variable hour employee, that's somebody that has a schedule that fluctuates above and below 30 hours. All right, think about that as somebody that stocks the shelves. They may work 20 hours this week. They may work 40 hours next week. They may work 10 the next. It truly is variable, and you don't know how many hours they're going to work. That's the definition of a variable hour employee. Now, one thing that always comes up is I'll get a call and they'll say, now Joe's worked 3 straight weeks for 30 hours, over 30 hours. Do I need to go ahead and offer him insurance? Well, by definition, a variable hour employee is someone who's going to fluctuate, right? So they're going to have periods of time they're over 30 hours. It may be that over Christmas is a busy time, so over Christmas they're working over 30 hours, or over Thanksgiving, or whatever those periods are, the summer, whatever those periods are, they do have where they may have a longer period of time where they're working over 30 hours. It may be that someone quit or somebody left, and so they're having to work more hours to pick that person's time up. Again, if these are not permanent, for instance, they didn't get a promotion or something of that, or their job didn't change to where that 30 hours is going to be the norm all year round, then they're still just a variable hour employee, and so they would fall into that measurement period calculation, and at the end of that calculation, you would determine if they're a full-time employee or not. Now, from these required calculations, the calculations are performed, typically for variable or seasonal employees. Technically, you are supposed to have, do your full-time as well, but realistically, if they're full-time, you know it, so you don't have to do that. But these variable and seasonal hours, we do have to perform these calculations. We also have to perform the required calculations based upon the applicable measurement period. And there's two types of measurement period, and we'll talk about both of those. It's the initial and the standard. We'll do that in a moment. But it's very important that we do that. And then we also, another reason for these calculations is in the reporting component, you don't know who to report, who to provide 1095s for, unless you do the calculations. Because everyone, and this is another common question, everybody that is a full-time employee at any point during the year or have met the requirements of the measurement period receive a 1095. So you have to do the calculations specifically with the measurement periods to figure out who has been a full-time employee during the year. And therefore, that's how you know who should get a 1095 form. Now, the measurement periods, basically what they are is it's just a designated period where you do the calculation to determine if they are a full-time equivalent or not. And that's basically we're just trying to figure out if they met the requirements where we have to offer them insurance. These measurement periods can be anywhere from 3 to 12 months. What I typically suggest for the grocery industry is 12 months, because what's going to happen is, because your workforce is typically so transient, there's going to be a great number of those variable hour employees that never meet the 12 months. They don't work their 12 months. So therefore, they won't get to a status where they're going to have to offer, and that greatly obviously decreases your risk of someone. Let's say you have a 6-month measurement period, and then they're getting insurance in 6 months, and then they're leaving. Also, what it does is it decreases your administration, because you don't want to have to run a measurement period calculation every 3 months. It's a lot, or 6 months. It's a lot easier to just do that once a year. So that's the reason I always suggest 12 months. Also, one thing with these measurement periods is they can differ depending on classes of employees. Now, you can do that. That's in the regulations. I generally don't recommend that, because it just increases your administrative burden. So now, instead of running one calculation, you're trying to keep up with 2 or 3 calculations, and when they start and when they stop and those things. So administratively, unless there's an economic reason to do that and to have those differing lengths and starting and end dates, I suggest you just kind of keep those all consistent. Now, as I said, you have 2 types of measurement periods. You have the initial and the standard. And there's a lot of confusion on this. There really is. Usually most people only do one. It's kind of like I mentioned a moment ago. What they may do is they just may look at the first 90 days, figure out if they work 30 hours or more, and then leave out, and then don't worry about it anymore. But you really don't. You really have more to do than that, and we'll talk about these. The initial measurement period, basically what we're doing is we're looking at variable and seasonal employees to see if they've met that initial period. And that initial period is going to be that defined period that we just talked about, typically 12 months. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at their first 12 months of employment, and based upon that first 12 months, we're going to see if they met the requirement to be offered insurance. Again, they can really fluctuate. They may work 21 weeks, 40 the next, and so forth, and they may have prolonged periods of 2 to 3 weeks or a month where they're working over 30 hours. But again, as long as they're not, that's not a change in duty, or that's not a permanent change, then they're still variable hour employees. So the other thing is, with these initial measurement period, again, they can be 3 to 12. We do want to make sure they're consistent as well, to make sure that they, you don't change those between people or typically between years. Again, I would do 12 months and keep it at that. Initial measurement period, when we look at this, here's just kind of an overall example, high-level example. So if someone's hired in January, let's say, they'll have an initial measurement period from February 1st. You can start the measurement period the first day of the following month. So we would start February 1st, and it would go through January 31st. On January 31st, would end that period, and then for the month of February, you have what they call an administrative period, and you can do the calculation to determine how many hours they worked and if they met the requirements. Now, one thing I will say in this as well is when you look at that calculation, and this is a big point of confusion. Typically what you hear, it's what I said, it's what a lot of people say, is they have the 30-hour per week average in their head, right? And that's the way these are expressed to see if someone's eligible or not. However, when we're talking about variable hour employees and we're talking about this measurement period, the magic number is not 30 hours a week, it's 1,560 hours in that measurement period. Now, basically, you just take the 30 hours times the 52 weeks, and that'll get you to the 1,560. But what happens, and this happens a lot, is you may have an individual, because they are variable, they are scheduled, they may be scheduled, they may not be scheduled, they may only work 49 weeks out of the year. The other 3 weeks, it's not that they're on vacation or a paid leave or anything like that, it's just they weren't scheduled, so they didn't work. And so in that scenario, if they average 30 hours a week and they work 49 weeks, they would only work 1,470 hours during that measurement period. If that's the case, they wouldn't meet the requirements because they worked under 1,560 hours. Again, that's always a common question, and that's something to be very cognizant of, because it is always that eligibility is always spoken about in that 30-hour average. So always keep that in mind. But effectively, so after the calculation, we do have, or after that measurement period, we do have that 30-day window. It's called the administrative period, that we then can perform the calculation and see if they worked the 1,560 hours. If they did, then on March 1st, we offer them insurance. The other thing to note that's important is after that, if our measurement period is 12 months, for the next 12 months, that individual is in their stability period. What that means is that individual is eligible to keep their insurance if they took it, if they were offered and they accepted it for the following 12 months. They're just guaranteed to have it, okay? And so then what happens is they after that 12 months is over, they fall back into the standard measurement period, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I did want to kind of lay that out on a timeline for you, just to kind of show how that works, because again, so many people skip this. They don't even consider this step, and this is an important step because most people, if they make an error, the error is they don't do the initial measurement period calculation, and when they don't do that calculation, they have eligible employees that they're not offering, which then goes against that 95% rule that we talked about earlier. Now, the standard measurement period, that's an annual process, right? So after we've kind of gotten through the initial measurement period, we've gotten through the stability period, what happens is we have a standard measurement period, and this is for all of your employees that have worked there for over 12 months if you're using a 12-month measurement period, okay? So that's the standard. If they have to have worked there for 12 months to be included in this calculation, okay? Again, it's probably going to be 12 months. That's the way most people do it in your industry. Now, typically, this is performed in conjunction with open enrollment, right? Because that's when you kind of open up and you're enrolling everybody. So they do the standard measurement period in conjunction with that. So in the open enrollment, they can offer the full-time employees, and then also any of those that meet the calculation, anybody that met the calculation under the standard measurement period, they can offer them as well. It's just easier administratively, so that's the way most people do it. And if you look at it, the standard measurement period, it is, again, it's annual. It's for everybody that's worked for fewer than 12 months. For more than 12 months. And so if I have a standard measurement period, if you're on a, let's say my measurement period is January to December, again, what happens is after that measurement period, I can have a 90-day administrative period. So I have from January to March to figure out who should be offered insurance, to do the calculation, to do the enrollments, get the paperwork back, get them enrolled for an effective March 1st. And then, just like with the initials, there's a stability period. If they get insurance, they're offered insurance, they accept that insurance effective March 1st, then get to keep that insurance for the next 12 months, regardless of whether they work 2 hours a week or 50 hours a week. They get to keep that insurance. So again, that's important, and this is most people do this step. Some don't, but most people do this step. But really, when we're talking about measurement periods, it's going to be both of those components. You have to measure a new employee basically after their 12-month anniversary. You're going to measure them. And then everybody else that's been there for over that 12 months, you're going to measure them in the standard measurement period. Okay? If you do that, that's going to tell you who you need to offer. Again, the initial measurement period is done pretty much every month. You have to do it because you're going to have new employees that are running out of that are meeting their 12-month anniversary date basically every month, if that makes sense. So this is not a one time of the year calculation. It's you do the standard measurement period every year, and just because of the way that the employees come and go, you'll more than likely have to do an initial measurement period every month because somebody's met their 12-month anniversary. So that's really the main things I wanted to talk about today, is to convey that to make sure we're doing these calculations so that we know who to offer. Not only is it big in the reporting, which is on everybody's mind, but also this is the way to make sure that you're not going to get bit by that 95% rule, and that you're offering the individuals that you should. It also mitigates your risk because it ensures that if you do mess up, hopefully you'll catch it that next month. And so that's very important. And so, that's the general disclaimer. Basically this isn't legal advice and so forth, but that's it for today. I will say, I know one question that I always get is, what's going to happen to the Affordable Care Act? And we don't know. Anybody that tells you they know, run, because they don't. But just from my perspective, this is what my belief is. The Affordable Care Act, a lot of it obviously is going to depend on the election. If you have a Democrat that is elected, more than likely there's not going to be much change, I wouldn't think. If there's a Republican, I think they're going to come in and they're going to try to do that, try to change it. Now, how do they change it? If it's going to be a full repeal, or if they're only going to take certain aspects of the law and repeal that, I don't know. But I do believe there will be some changes if the Republican comes in. I think it's naive to think that anyone's going to come in. Last time I saw, I think they have 5 to 6 million people on the exchange. And so I think it's naive to think that someone's going to walk in and take away those subsidies from those individuals on the exchange day one. I think it's going to take time, whether that's 2017, 2018, 2019, I don't know. But from a political standpoint, it doesn't make sense that somebody's going to come in and repeal this day one. All these people go, lose their insurance. That would just be a political nightmare. So we'll see, but I think this election will be key to figure out really what the future of this act is.